The Scream Kings are in no way responsible for any encounters with the paranormal, extraterrestrial abductions, eldritch insanity, hauntings, curses, hexes, demonic possessions, cryptozoological sightings, or any loss of sleep that may result from listening to this podcast.
This is the Scream Kings podcast. This is Max George.
I'm Nathaniel Darkish.
Until we got our hands on those podcasts, we had no idea what we were dealing with. No idea. Ooh. I feel like I always have to make a noise.
You always do, and I've started cutting some of them out.
No, they're lovely. It's probably going to be the happiest part of this entire episode.
Yeah, this one's going to get a little dark. Okay, so we are talking the Poughkeepsie tapes, which is a 2007 film that didn't actually get released in any, meaningful way until, 2013, I think?
Today, police made a shocking discovery in Poughkeepsie.
A third body was found here today.
A Poughkeepsie couple vanished over the weekend, seemingly without a trace.
Do you mind if I film this? I'm making a little movie about my trip.
Yeah, this flew under the radar. It's crazy.
Well, I mean, it got shelved for a long time. The first release of it wasn't theatrical or anything. It was VOD, let's see, 6 years after. There wasn't a video physical release, of DVD or Blu-ray that you could buy until 10 years after it came out.
Yeah, and there are a lot of kind of rumors that I read online about why that was. For those of you who listen to our podcast, this movie in particular, I think is one of the more grittier movies that we've probably reviewed. It's a snuff kind of film footage. I guess the basic plot here is there's a local police department in Poughkeepsie that discovers these tapes, these VHS tapes, and there is 60 of them, Nathaniel?
No, there's 800 of them.
Oh, wow, I'm grievously wrong. Well, I need to add that to things that did not work with the movie. But they go through these tapes and they start to unravel this crazy legacy of this wackadoo serial killer in the community who they've been trying to track for years. And it's his kind of video journal of all of these crimes he's committed. And wowza.
Let me make a couple little tweaks to what you said. So, one, they really haven't been tracking him. The big idea is more that this serial killer has totally flown under their radar for many years. He's been killing people, but he has been doing it in a huge variety of different ways. He's very much playing off of how the police track down serial killers, and is mixing up his methods of killing, mixing up his victims, mixing up everything, so that way they aren't connecting all of these killings and are instead just, kind of associating them as just random killings, or, sometimes he even went as far as to string a few things together and specifically, make it look like it was a cop. He's doing all kinds of stuff, so it's a big variety of the kinds of things that he's doing. And so, all of these tapes are tapes of, the different killings, but also, torture sessions. There's a huge variety of things that are on these. And, how the movie is structured, you're only seeing, a small fraction of them kind of in between these very Dateline kind of show sort of format between it, with interviews with police officers and with different, people who are involved in finding it and investigating it, and kind of just going through what they know about the killings.
Yeah, and now that you say that out loud, that's very much the case with this movie. And I think we could talk about this a little bit further on in the show, but the Dateline aspect of it I think contributed to me misunderstanding the show. I don't know if it's the perfect way to present it. And anyway, we can get to that when we get to it. But overall, this movie is pretty dark.
Well, I mean, you use the term snuff film, and this isn't an actual snuff film, but it's like a pseudo snuff film where it plays with that very much like home footage. It looks like a real person doing real crimes and real unspeakable things to people. They made it look as authentic as possible, and it's kind of hard to watch.
Yeah, and that works really well, and we'll get to that. The home footage is not great quality, but at the same time, creators behind all of this, I think, took a lot of time in making it look as authentic as some gritty amateur home video footage would actually look like. Yeah. And so, like you say, it is difficult to watch, not only because it's some dark and intense scene, but because the quality of the tapes is not great. And it adds to the show, but also kind of hurts it in some regards. But again, this show, the serial killer, is very depraved, very violent, and very kind of foot on the gas pedal. There's no slowing down, really, once he gets started.
I guess, should we kind of talk about some of the stuff that worked for us? And I think kind of some more of the major plot elements will kind of come through just us discussing what we like, what we don't like.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, I think the intensity of the entire show was what I really enjoyed the most. There was a lot of cheese that we can kind of get to later, especially with the police department. But a lot of the scenes with Cheryl, who is kind of the main victim of this serial killer's crusade, her acting and her plot really was captivating in the most tragic way. And then just kind of the serial killer's MO. He's this very angry individual, and he very much likes to control his victims. There were a ton of very torture-esque scenes that you see where he's yelling at them and grading them, torturing them, slowly killing them, essentially. And you see that, and the intensity and the rawness of all of that when you're just watching it on a TV, it really becomes unsettling as the movie goes on.
For sure. So, yeah, you mentioned Cheryl. So, I guess, kind of filling in that plot element. So, Cheryl is a character who, so basically she was kidnapped by him and was held as his prisoner for years, like 15 years or something crazy like that. During all of that time, he, degraded her. He, basically slowly brainwashed her. And so there are times where she eventually starts, assisting with some of the torture, or at least was, present while he was torturing people. And then ultimately she actually gets free. So, this is a spoiler for late in the movie, but by the end of it, basically the police get this anonymous tip about this house. They go to this house and they find her just hiding in the house, and then and she's alive and has survived all this horrible torture. And then that's at this point that they find all the tapes. And so they weren't aware of this serial killer until they find her and all of the evidence that he himself has made.
She had a bigger part to play in all of this as well, because to me, watching this movie, the serial killer really was looking for the right person, I think, to brainwash and kind of turn into his slave. And everyone just was not cutting it until he found Cheryl. But tragically, once he did find Cheryl, his motives, of course, didn't stop there. He continued to kill. But I think she was, in some regard, the prize. And that dynamic was really fascinating. I haven't seen that, I think, the way they portrayed it in a movie before. Yeah,
there's a certain level of truly horrific realism to that.
Yeah.
That is really rare to see. You get little snippets of that kind of idea in other things, specifically Hannibal, especially the book Hannibal and the film Hannibal, it plays a little bit of that with Hannibal and Clarice and him trying to kind of make her his trying to dominate her and get her into his world. That kind of idea persists there, or in a lot of fiction, but yeah, it's usually to a much smaller degree. And with this, it just they really kind of let you soak up how awful it is, and also kind of how I interpret his intentions with Cheryl is that it really wasn't about having a slave or having someone to do his bidding or whatever. That's kind of what it looks like on the surface, but I think really what it boils down to is that he wanted to create a scenario in which, when he chose to reveal himself, her having been kidnapped, her still being alive as a physical testament to how awful he is, was really his motivation. He wanted to horrify the public with what he'd done when he decided to reveal it all. And so that's kind of what he successfully does in the fiction of this film, is that he leaves her alive and then calls the police so they can come find her and find out about all the awful things he's done, and then she's the living testimony of the monster that he is.
And I would agree with you to a certain point, because I think it started out as a very sexual kind of domination type of an experience, and then when he slowly started to master his craft even more, I do agree that it kind of evolved into that as kind of a final stamp of, hey, this is what I'm capable of, and y'all still haven't found me. So I think they're interconnected in some regard. But tell me more about why you thought the ending of this film was so horrifying for you. You told me when I was watching it that there was a scene that just utterly rotted you to the core. Yeah. Talk to us about that.
Okay, so again, this is going to the very end, but so for a lot of the film, you don't know that Cheryl is actually alive, that she survived this whole experience. So it's not until the very last act of the film that the filmmakers reveal that, and so then they have an interview with her. And so and it's really performed very effectively. The actress really knocks it out of the park in this scene. But basically, they have the filmmakers asking questions to her about, all the awful things she endured. And she kind of is just not really responsive until finally it's just her and them. And, and she's making sure that, her family members aren't around to hear this thing. And she's like, do you want to really know how I feel about this? And they're like, well, yeah. And she said, he loves me. He's going to come back for me. This is all just temporary. He loves me, and that's why he did everything, and I love him. And then it's at that moment that you see her scratch her arm, and then you see that she is missing most of one of her arms. That was part of the torture, and this is the first time you see that revealed. And so, she is literally scratching at something that was a horrific wound, and she's just totally professing her love for him and saying that everything he did was because he loved her. And that's horrifying because, this is after you have seen scenes of her, weeping as other people are being tortured, scenes of her being tortured and being forced to say things like, I'm happy that you killed my family over and over again. You've seen her be brainwashed and coerced into totally being, reduced to rubble. And then you see that long-term effect that even after he has cut off her freaking arm, this is what she's been reduced to. So for me, that was just the biggest gut punch, because again, that's the most raw, real element of the film. It was just that is something that is the real life horror that some people have to endure, and they don't recognize it as horrific.
Yeah, I think that scene came towards the end of the film, and it really was kind of the tragic culmination of everything that this serial killer did. And it mirrors what you just said, that he left his mark not only on society but on someone who's still alive. They will never get out of that torture, and that's horrifying.
Yeah, and then it kind of follows it up with like she killed herself like 2 weeks later, and then after that he steals her body.
Yeah, and that's how the movie opens. Is it's this kind of cryptic scene where you see a grave that's been unburied and a car is yanking out the coffin, and you have no idea really what's going on. There's some mention of a girl that's gone missing, but you don't really piece it together that it's Cheryl until that end.
And it basically, it says like, yeah, that tape was sent in to us afterward.
So for me, I think really there were two harrowing scenes, and the first one I want to talk about is kind of tangential to the whole movie. There was a lot of footage that didn't really have much to do with the kind of actual plot of Cheryl and the serial killer and the police department. There was a lot of kind of gore porn, if we can use that term, which is fine. Right. It served its purpose in this movie very well, I think. But there was one scene in particular. The serial killer liked to wear different types of masks. And in one of these films that the police department was watching was this poor innocent girl tied up. Her mouth was taped and she was clearly in a panic. And out of the darkness in the back, you see the serial killer crawling on all fours, but like reversed. Down. Yeah, kind of like Reagan does in The Exorcist. But it's very, very slow. And he's wearing just this creepy, plain white face mask. There's no features to it or anything. And he's in almost like a tight black suit. And so it looks like this inhuman spider thing crawling in the back.
Yeah, and it's like this Commedia dell'arte mask with like a long nose and all of that. It's very creepy.
The footage is very amateurish. It's not high quality. It's grainy. The picture's kind of coming in and out, and so you see him slowly creeping into the camera frame. He slides up her body, looking at her in his face. And then he has, I can't remember if it's this scene or another, where he has like syringe needles taped to his fingers that he's slowly bringing closer and closer to this poor innocent girl's face. And I could not blink in this moment, Nathaniel. It was horrifying. I haven't felt that scared in a movie since probably Hereditary.
Yeah, that was definitely a harrowing scene.
But even more than that is towards the beginning of the movie, where we see some of his first videos. There's a scene where he's driving in a car and he sees a little girl out in the front yard.
And this is his first kill, to clarify.
And he has the video camera in his hand, takes it out of the car, and you're seeing all of this. And of course you know it's fiction, but the quality and the acting and just everything makes you really question it, and you think you're watching a serial killer approach a little girl in the front yard of her house, talking to her so innocently. He asks her if she would like to see the other end of the camera. She's clearly in a lot of distress, but he almost forces her to take the camera, and then you hear her just punch her in the head. And even talking about it right now, it was just so authentic and so real. It makes you almost nauseated because you know shit like this is happening out there. And the way that they created this film just really breaks your heart. Oh, it was horrifying. Horrifying.
Yeah, and I think part of what made those kinds of scares very effective is that it didn't feel like a movie in terms of like the levels of gore or things like that. Like they just, there's just the thud, and then suddenly, him running off, and then just like has a card that just says like, oh yeah, like that body was found.
Last episode in our Annabelle Schmamabelle, we talked about killing this infant in that movie and how that would have made the scares better. And it was almost trivial because it was such a a paranormal type of a movie that we could almost talk about it like it never actually really would happen. But then you flip that with a movie like this, where they do such a great job at keeping it authentic that I feel almost bad bringing it up again. Like we're bringing that energy into the air. So yeah, it's wild. It's not for the faint of heart. It's a very gritty and very raw show. And I want to talk about what you just mentioned, is that a lot of the scenes in this movie, and why I think it was so powerful, is what you said. It was simple. Scenes were very gory and very kind of torture porn, but at the same time, they weren't over the top. Blood wasn't spouting out of anyone's arteries. Faces weren't being peeled off. It was simple. The scenes were terrifying. There wasn't any wild special effects, though, going on, or animatronics or anything like that. The simplicity behind it made it real. It gave it a level of authenticity that scared me on a very visceral level. And I think horror movies need to tap into that. You know, we see a lot of shows out there, and Annabelle's a great example, where they try and go so over the top that it loses that scare factor. And shows like or go ahead.
Oh, just because it becomes removed from reality. It doesn't feel like it is something that could happen anymore.
Yeah, and even the It remakes, like Pennywise as a monster is very scary, but it becomes so fantastical that you just don't really associate it with anything that happens in real life. And
there's a spectacle to it.
You know, going back to our fan base of Hereditary, you know, the demon being portrayed as a glimmer of light, that was powerful. We weren't expecting that. And similar in this movie, the simplicity scares you. It makes you feel like this could happen to you. It makes you feel like your upstairs neighbor or coworker could be in this type of a situation. It's wild.
Because they could. That's the horrifying thing.
I'm listening to a podcast right now about Jeffrey Dahmer, and it's talking about how he had friends growing up, and he was kind of a class clown, and, you know, everyone knows that individual that Jeffrey Dahmer once was. Little did they know he ended up killing 17 young boys. Like, that's real life, and that's why I think this movie is so intense.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, and I'm just going to put in a little plug for a thing that is probably worth your time if Dahmer is interesting to you. It is the graphic novel, well, I guess it's hard because it's not actually a novel because it's not fiction. The non-fiction graphic novel, My Friend Dahmer, which is written by a comic artist who he went to high school with Dahmer. And so, like they weren't, like, close friends, but they were, you know, like, casual buddies at school. And so it's kind of dealing with that, like, weirdness of knowing this person who becomes this monster. So that's a really powerful piece. And it was adapted into a movie. I haven't seen the film version, but the graphic novel version really was powerful. It was really interesting to see that unique perspective. One thing that I think is really something that really I enjoyed, just kind of from the, you know, looking at this as a meta piece, is, you know, it's in the fiction of this world, this serial killer is still at large. And so they say in the film, like near the end, that once this goes to theaters, I bet he's going to be in the theater over and over and over again, and he's going to watch it 1,000,000 times because, like, this is what he wants. He wants people to know what he's done. He's going to sit there and he's going to watch people's reactions. And I think that was such a clever idea that it makes it kind of a real shame that this movie didn't actually go to theaters, because I'm sure when that line dropped in a theater, it would have gotten such great reactions from people, because, like, your instinct immediately is to look over your shoulder. Like, even though you know it's all fiction, it's not real, at that moment, like, it would break that, you know, kind of barrier between fiction and reality even more, and make you feel like the serial killer is in the room with me. And I think that was brilliant.
Well, and that layered on top of all of the shootings that have happened in theaters in the last decade or so would even make it scarier, unfortunately, that we have people in the world that do that, but it's a very good point. Okay, should we move into maybe a few things that we didn't think were so great about this show? Because it's not perfect.
Yeah.
Not at all.
Do you want to kick us off?
Sure. The first thing I kind of wanted to mention, probably the biggest issue I had with the movie was the police department. They seemed kind of dysfunctional and incompetent in everything they did, and that kind of was on top of this serial killer almost being invincible. 800 tapes, that's a little much, I think.
And I mean, to be fair, to clarify, it doesn't say that it's like 800 victims, but rather that...
Right.
Like, yeah, and they said that, like, I don't know, 600 of them are just like him, like filming Cheryl and doing, her doing stuff. So
still, I think it's kind of excessive. It seems a little hyperbolic. But with all of his changing MOs and the setup of this other poor guy who was incarcerated when the police department thought he was the serial killer, and just how he is still at large, and the whole Cheryl thing. At the end of the movie, I kind of felt like they made the serial killer out to be something almost inhuman. I mean, even the craziest of serial killers, John Wayne Gacy, Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, they all made human mistakes which eventually would catch up to them. And I guess I wanted that humanity a little bit. Even if they didn't catch him, that maybe they were on the trail for a little bit. I don't know. I just felt like it was too perfect of a serial killer, if that makes sense. And I know you had some issues with the police department as well, so please let me know.
Yeah, so I definitely agree that those characters just didn't feel as real. Like, it wasn't even necessarily like their incompetence that bothered me, because I mean, honestly, like a lot of it really does boil down to that he is, mixing up his MOs and his victims and all of that. And so, like, in real life, yeah, that would make it extremely hard to track this killer. The acting and stuff didn't feel quite as realistic. They were kind of going for the Dateline kind of thing where, it's like people who don't know how to talk into a camera sometimes. But they almost went a little bit too far with that. And also just like the fact that it's all shot like it is, that an episode of that kind of, true crime show with these interviews and all of that, it made it so it kind of lost a little bit of that intensity for me, because it feels safe to watch that kind of thing where you watch these things. It's like, oh, and the severed head was found in the whatever. We found the severed head in the river, and you're like, okay, I'm used to hearing that kind of thing on Dateline. It doesn't like affect me the same way because it had that format. Yeah, I just like didn't feel that same emotional level of intensity. If they had just been like, here's this found footage thing, buckle up, then I just would have been like, oh well. Crap.
I think that added a little bit of the incompetence factor to me, because it was so Dateline-esque that you had these, donut-loving policemen, and they were trying to find this crazy serial killer, and they just can't find him. It almost felt cartoonish in some aspects to me, that they just kind of were bumbling through this case. Even, I don't know, it was frustrating to watch at times, because it altered the pace and the feel of the show. We've talked about a lot of these horrific scenes that really terrified me, and then we would have 20 minutes of the bumbling police department, and the pacing felt so intense and so visceral, and then it just like slammed on the brake. And that was tough. And the blunders that the cops made also kind of felt contrived. Not in the sense that they were trying to blame someone for these murders for the sake of the media, but contrived in a way that they were trying to hold the audience's attention to the show. Kind of like a false sense of security. And then plot twist, it wasn't this person. Like, I don't know. It felt cheap. It felt really cheap.
Yeah, it definitely felt like it had some of the beats of like, okay, and now there'll be a commercial break and that kind of thing, which didn't actually fit what they said it was going to be, that it was going to be in theaters and all that kind of stuff. It just, there was a sort of like a tonal disconnect, I guess you could say.
But you make a great point, I think, there, that it felt almost like a commercial. It could have been done better, I think. The police department cheapened the authenticity, and it almost made it feel like they weren't taking this seriously. They've seen this footage. This needs to be a bigger deal.
Yeah, and also, like, I think it sometimes spent too much time having certain people just be, like, shocked by the footage, just, like, it cutting to someone. It's like, I had to, review all the stuff, and my wife accidentally, like, watched part of it once, and she didn't, like, talk to me for, like, 6 months.
Yeah, like, that had no purpose.
Yeah, just, like, things like that. To me, that was a little bit too much. You're just like, yeah, I'm, like, the only person who's seen some of those ones. You're like, I don't know. I'm pretty sure with a case this intense, there would be many experts going through all of this intensely, not just like one guy watching it all.
Well, and to kind of piggyback off of that, because of all of those slower moments, I felt like the scary scenes, there weren't enough of them. The ones they had were horrifying, don't get me wrong, but it didn't feel like there were very many of those. There were a lot of tense, gritty, creepy moments, but I wanted more of those child murder scenes. I wanted more of the creepy black crawl scenes and more of the Cheryl torture scenes. Ugh, this makes me sound like a horrible person. I'm glad we're speaking
a monster.
I'm glad we're speaking to friends. But I wanted more of that. I think it could have pushed it a little bit more.
I don't even necessarily need more of those things, but just I just wanted, a little bit more time in the tapes and a little less time with the cops.
That's what I'm trying to say.
Because, the whole point is these tapes. I mean, it's called the Poughkeepsie tapes. I just wanted to get a little bit more of, like, when he calls it in, like, you almost expect him to have, a tape where he just is, like, directly taunting the cops or something like that, but that never happens, and that kind of thing I think would have been interesting. Another thing just didn't quite work for me as well was just, it talks about how the tapes with Cheryl is like 600 of the 800 tapes or something, crazy like that. But as far as her actual, like, amount of time in the movie, it took forever to get to her. Forever.
Yeah. I mean, like, 2/3 of the movie didn't even have her in it, really.
Yeah, and so, like, once it did get to her, like, it was, it paid off in a really powerful way, but they just kept talking about her and talking about her and talking about her, and then you finally see when he abducts her. I think it just would have been better if it maybe had that, in the first third of the movie instead of the last third of the movie, because by that point you're just kind of like, yeah, we get it, like, yeah, he's doing bad stuff, but, like, that was, like, where it started to actually, like, take shape in terms of being more of a story as opposed to just a random smattering of awful crimes. So just, like, from a storytelling perspective, I think it would have been better to front load that or a lot more. It just would have, I think, kept my interest in it even better. Also, just, like, the fact that he does dig up Cheryl's body and send in the tape and stuff like that, like, it just didn't ever quite, like, gel as to why he did that exactly. Spent a lot of time building up to that for it to just kind of be like, I don't quite get what his intent was there. Also, I really didn't like that they had a post-credit scene of just, another snippet of a tape. It felt like something that wouldn't happen. It's all shot in this very realistic, like, hey, this is grounded in reality. We're acting like this is a real thing. And having a post-credit scene, to me, says quite the opposite.
Yeah, it does exactly what you just said. Like, we're meant to believe that this has actually happened, but there's a post-credit scene. I don't know. I think post-credit scenes are a fad right now,
Yeah, and like, I'm okay with them in certain formats. Like, in a Marvel movie, whatever. But when we're having it, like, this is the, just, like, cutting to another torture thing, it just feels like the filmmakers are making this, like, cheap grab based on, like, someone actually getting tortured. Like, that'd be awful. Like,
yeah,
just, like, instantly, like, kills the credibility of this being what it claims to be. As a whole, I feel like it is an effective film. And I don't think we mentioned this yet, but it was made by John, Eric, and Drew Dowdle, who are the brothers who are responsible for one of your very favorite movies, As Above, So Below.
Yeah. Anything else you wanted to say about it, or should we give it our ratings, Nathaniel?
It's not a film for everybody.
No.
It's definitely it's not your typical horror movie. Very grounded in that, like, very authentic experience. If you're listening to this episode having not seen it, definitely, kind of look at what interests you in horror and make a decision based on that, because it is, not for everybody, for sure.
And I think sometimes on our show we talk a lot about gateway horror movies, Conjurings, the Annabelles, a lot of that. This is not one of those.
This is the far end of the other side of the spectrum.
I think this is for more of those veteran horror fans out there who want a movie to push them to their limits, to get them to be scared. Don't go rent this movie with your girlfriend/boyfriend and be like, hey, let's snuggle up and watch this movie together because we want to be scared. Because you'll both end up wetting the couch and it will just be a disaster.
Mm-hmm. So, ratings.
I gave it a 6 for Crowns. It's a very solid show, not perfect, as we've mentioned. And I think a lot of the things that make it not great really hurt it, really cheapen the authenticity. So I gave it a 6, and then I also gave it a 6 for scares. The scares, when they come, hit you like a ton of bricks. We just need more of them.
So, similarly, I gave it a 6 for Crowns because, I think it is an extremely well-crafted film, but, yeah, there are just some storytelling elements and things that just didn't quite work out, as we talked about. And then, for Screams, I decided to give it a 7, just because, when it does get when it did get under my skin, it did a really good job of that. But again, there was just too many long sections with police. All of that said, should we move into our new segment called Sinister Psych?
We thought this would be a great episode to kind of talk a little bit more about some stuff that we have talked about in other episodes but haven't really devoted a lot of time. And I think it's going to be really fun to dive into some of the stuff behind the scenes that probably inspired some of these movies.
For sure. And so today we're going to talk about a few different elements that deal with the psychology of the film and the things that happen in it. And again, like, a lot of this will be psychology stuff that you see pop up in other movies, but this movie, really try to lean into the realism of this. First thing I'm going to talk about is Stockholm Syndrome. It was really interesting doing some research on Stockholm Syndrome because, you can kind of look at Cheryl Dempsey as this character that is sort of the epitome of this idea of Stockholm Syndrome. But I'm not actually 100% certain if she fits under that umbrella quite as neatly as I maybe first thought before I started doing research.
Well, and I'm sure you'll talk about it, but I think there hasn't been a ton of actual scientific research done on Stockholm Syndrome. It's more a theory than it is an actual kind of syndrome because it's just so difficult to study.
Yes. So I guess I'll kind of define Stockholm Syndrome, and then I'll talk about some of the effects of it, and then some of the kind of controversy around it. So for starters, and a lot of this is just straight from Wikipedia, so I might be summarizing some of the things from there. So credit to the writers and editors at Wikipedia. But victims of Stockholm Syndrome develop positive feelings toward their captors and sympathy for their causes and goals, and negative feelings towards the police or authorities. So this is typically, even going on after they return to their normal lives. And so, it's most famously, from an instance in Stockholm where I believe it was a bank robbery, and, a lot of the hostages in that situation ended up feeling very positively towards the people who held them captive for long periods of time. So, some of the physical and psychological effects is that it causes confusion, blurred memory, victims to refuse to accept reality of events. It often has recurring flashbacks. There's often a lack of feeling, fear, helplessness, hopelessness, aggression, depression, guilt, a feeling of dependence on their captor, and PTSD. There is anxiety, irritability, cautiousness, and estrangement. Typically, they feel estranged from their normal life and feel dependent and on their captor, and like a feeling of anxiety because they're not with them. And also, some of the other effects is that it can cause increased effects of pre-existing conditions, especially things like heart conditions. If you already had like mental illnesses such as anxiety and depression, it tends to intensify those. And also, because it affects the way that you sleep and the way that you eat and things like that, there's often health effects related to that as well. A research group found that even though there's a lot of like media coverage of the idea of Stockholm Syndrome, it's a popular thing to talk about on the news, especially whenever there's something like a hostage situation. There is very little research into it, as you mentioned. And a lot of that research ends up being kind of contradictory. A lot of the things don't really line up with each other very nicely. Some researchers, really just kind of want to apply this idea more to just, all definitions of abuse and coercive control and things like that. And so, there's not really a clear definition of Stockholm Syndrome, nor is there a real clear way to define it. So really, when people are victims of this, it really kind of more feeds into this idea of abusive power and control.
Well, and to kind of add some context here, I work as a project manager for a research company. So I, on a daily basis, am working with IRBs, which is essentially the governing entity of any sort of research program that occurs. And something like Stockholm Syndrome is incredibly difficult to get IRB approval for, because whenever you involve some sort of risk group or risk minority, the levels of protection that the federal government put on those groups for their protection, of course, drastically is increased. And so how are you going to do an authentic research study on an individual who's been abused? It's just not heard of, and it's very difficult to get government approval to do this type of research. So a lot of this, like we've talked about, is very theoretical and kind of piecemealed from bits and pieces of research that's been done, because you're working with individuals who have been damaged, and you have to be so sensitive when it comes to that.
Yeah, and how are you going to do things like a double-blind study?
Exactly.
Barring, actually doing horrible things to people. Kind of as I mentioned, really all of this really feeds more into the idea of abusive power and control, which is, kind of in and of itself a much more researched phenomenon, because simply we have more instances of people who have gone through it. And so basically, what happens in a situation with coercive control like this is that the things that make the victim of it vulnerable are exploited by the person who is abusing them. So the more vulnerable you are, the more likely you are to be a victim in these kind of situations. And so what happens is that there's a thing called traumatic bonding that happens. So basically, the abuser will have a cycle of abuse, and then occasionally, have cycles of being rewarded. And so it creates a powerful bond, because they are basically often controlling, breaking you down, and then building you back up. This can make it so people who are victims of it, view this kind of abuse as normal, legitimate, rational, and feel like when they are abused, it's their fault. So it's fully plugged into ideas of isolation, gaslighting, mind games. There's a lot of ways that you can look at it. A lot of times, things like drugs or alcohol or sleep deprivation are incorporated into the way that the person is controlling them, and so it's really horrifying. And these are things that are unfortunately fairly common. Really coercive control is a tactic of many abusive people. So what we're looking at is the tactics really boil down to this cycle of violence. They'll do things like threaten, cause them harm. Often the abuser will threaten to commit suicide. They will, force the person that they're coercing to do things like illegal actions, because then they can say, if you don't do what I say, then I'll call the cops on you for the bad thing that you did. Yeah, there's all of these cycles, and then they follow that economic abuse. They often take away any economic independence of the person that they're abusing. They will isolate them, basically be the only person that they're interacting with. Whenever anything goes wrong, even like say they're hurting someone, if there's blood that gets on someone, then they'll get mad at them for getting blood on the carpet, even though just slowly breaking them down, and then occasionally just having just tons of love and care and like, oh, like I'm so glad to have you, and so they feel like in order to be validated, a victim of this will feel like they need their abuser in their life, because otherwise they're not having those constant, or those not constant, but the regular affirmations that come in the middle of the cycle of abuse.
When you think about it kind of on a neurological sense, you get broken down to the point where your body is probably not secreting any sort of dopamine. And dopamine is a neurotransmitter that helps us attach to things. It makes us feel good. And then they flip that on its head and they provide you with a lot of love and care, even though it's in their twisted kind of scenario, that you then have this surge of dopamine, which causes you to bond and to create these kind of weird relationships with your captor. It's very complicated, and it has roots in science, and it's horrible that it can happen to people, because it's tragic.
Yeah, it's truly horrifying, and yeah, again, like, this is something that, unfortunately, I guess if you see this happening in your own life or in the lives of people that you care about, there are, definitely things in place, ways to report that kind of thing, to help people get help. I'll see if I can find some, good, like, domestic abuse hotlines or the like to kind of help out, because yeah, like, that kind of thing is a very real, very horrifying thing that people go through here. So National Domestic Abuse and Violence Hotline is 1-800-799-7233. So yeah, if us saying these things are sending off any triggers, please call that.
Let's talk about how we're staying spooky, Nathaniel.
Yeah, let's do it. Okay, so the way I've been staying spooky is by making a whole bunch of really awesome t-shirts and stuff. So I'm sure a lot of you guys out there have seen a lot of the really cool designs that we've had added to our social media and all of that. And so I actually finally sat down and turned all of them into t-shirt / whatever you want designs, so they can now be purchased for t-shirts and stickers and laptop cases and all sorts of cool stuff. So definitely check out those, because they're awesome, and I'm going to be sporting a Scream Kings shirt finally, now that I've made all those.
Yeah, the Ouija planchette one is amazing, and I want it on everything that I own.
They're all amazing.
I am reading an amazing book that you are going to read when I'm finished, called Come Closer, and it is by Sarah Gran, G-R-A-N. It's a very simplistic, to the point, no bells and whistles book about a woman who gets possessed. And it's only about 120 pages long. It's not very long at all, but it has gone under my skin more than reading The Exorcist did. I love The Exorcist book. It's very, very slow until the end. This, I don't know, the writing is so simple in a way that it really makes you feel that it's actually happening, and it's very authentic. I was staying at a hotel this last weekend, and I was reading from it, and I had some creepy nightmares, and I attribute it to reading the book. So if you haven't read it, go look it out. I think it was $8 on Amazon for the paperback. Great read.
Awesome.
I hope everyone stays spooky.
Stay spooky.
Need even more Scream Kings? Here's our obligatory shameless social media plug. Follow us on Twitter or Instagram at Scream Kings Pod. You could also email us at screamkingspodcast@gmail.com. Help us reach a wider audience of horror fans by leaving a review on iTunes
or by sharing a link on social media. You can also support the show by going to patreon.com/ScreamKings. Stay spooky.